Are you tired of struggling to find a reliable opening with black in chess? Look no further than the Caro-Kann Defense. In this video, we'll take you through the basic principles and common variations to help you dominate with the Caro-Kann. Get ready to elevate your game and confidently fight back against e4 with this powerful and solid opening. The Caro-Kann Defense starts off with the moves e4, c6, d4, and d5. Here, white has many options. He can play captures, which would be the exchange variation. He can move his pawn forward, which would be the advanced variation. He can defend the pawn on e4 with the knight, either by going knight c3, which is the classical variation, or knight to d2 as well, which is the modern variation. And he can also play a move like pawn to f3, supporting the e4 pawn, which would be the fantasy variation. First, let's take a look at the easiest and simplest line, which is the exchange variation. So here, after captures, white actually has two options. He can play a normal developing move like knight here, or he could play a more aggressive pawn to c4, which is the pan-off variation. Let's first take a look at what if white plays less aggressive and just play normal development. This variation is pretty easy for black, as all you have to do is just develop your pieces, bring them out normally like this, and you should have no problems in this position. The idea going to the middle game in this line is very simple. Since the c file is open, as we traded our c pawn away, you will want to put your rook here on the c file to control it, and later on you could also prepare pushing the a and the b pawns on the queen side to launch some sort of attack with a6, b5 followed by b4. This variation is pretty easy and you should have no problems with black. Right, so that was what if white plays a normal developing move like knight to f3. Now we need to look at what if white plays pawn to c4, which is the pan-off variation. Here, as black, we need to play more solidly with pawn to e6 to support the center pawn, and we cannot develop our bishop to f5 or to g4. Even though pawn to e6 might seem like a bad move because it blocks our own bishop, don't worry because our bishop can develop this way later on in the game. So white will set up something like this, and here we have a pro tip, because for black, if white develops this like square bishop either to e2 or to d3, let's say he plays bishop e2 now, we can capture the pawn on c4, forcing his bishop to move again to recapture the pawn. So basically, we just won a tempo and gain a move, which is why white should capture the pawn on d5 first before developing his bishop. So after capture, now we recapture back with the knight, because we want to achieve the situation where white has an isolated center d4 pawn. An isolated pawn is a pawn that's not surrounded or not protected by pawns beside them. So for example, this d4 pawn is an isolated pawn because there's no more pawn on e3 or on c3 or e or c pawns to protect the d4 pawn. So this makes the pawn weak later on in the middle game and the end game as well, and the idea for black is just to put pressure on this center pawn. Compared to black's pawn structure, we have four pawns on the king side and 2 pawns on the queen side, so black's pawn structure is pretty solid and there are no problems with the pawns. And after some normal developing moves like this, you do not have to worry about the diagonal on the h7 pawn, because even though the bishop looks menacingly and dangerous staring at our h7 pawn, there's no threats of, for example, knight to g5, because our bishop and our queen both protects the square. Also, later on, we can put our bishop onto f6 to put further pressure on the pawn on d4. And as mentioned earlier, pawn to e6 is not a bad move, even though we block our bishop this way, because we can develop our bishop with pawn to b6 and bishop to b7 later, obtaining this diagonal instead. And you can also double up along the d files or the c file, and the whole main idea is just to put pressure on the d4 pawn. But before we move to the other variations, if you found this video helpful so far, please take a moment to hit the like and subscribe button. By doing so, you'll be supporting our mission to create high quality chess content like this video to help players like you improve your game. Alright, so we have discussed the exchange variation. Now let's take a look at line number 2, which would be the advanced variation with pawn to e5. Now here, we have two options. We can play either bishop to f5, which is the main line, or we could play pawn to c5. Actually, I would recommend you guys to play pawn to c5 in this position, especially for players who are familiar with the French defense, because the pawn structure is very similar to a French defense advanced variation, with the only exception being that e6 is not played yet. So as black, we are able to develop our bishop either to g4 to pin the knight later on to the queen, or to f5 so that we do not trap our bishop on c8. So here, let's say white plays pawn to c3, which is a common idea in the French advanced variation as well, trying to support the center pawn. And after captures, we play knight to c6 first, knight f3, bishop to g4, we pin the knight to the queen without bishop. Let's say white plays bishop e2, trying to unpin himself. We capture the pawn on d4, captures, and now we play e6. And the main difference here compared to the French defense would be that our bishop manages to be on g4 or on f5 rather than being trapped on c8 without being able to be developed because it's blocked by the e6 pawn. And after several moves something like this, now the idea is simple. We just have to put pressure on the d4 pawn, and we can do so by playing a move like knight to e7 followed by knight to f5. Both the knights put tremendous pressure on the d4 pawn, and we could also follow up with queen to b6, bringing more attackers to the pawn. We also need to discuss what if white doesn't play pawn to c3 and opts to capture our c5 pawn instead. Here there's no problem and there's no rush to recapture the pawn on c5. We could play a move like queen to a5 check and then capturing the c5 pawn in the next move, but we are in no hurry and we can play a move like knight to c6, attacking the e5 pawn instead, because since white captured our pawn on c5, he no longer has the d4 pawn to support his e5 pawn. And let's say white plays a move like knight to f3, trying to defend the pawn on e5. Similar idea, we play bishop to g4, giving this pin. Our next threat is to play knight takes e5, utilizing this pin over here. So let's say white plays a move like bishop to e2. We can play pawn to e6, and we would like to recapture the c5 pawn with our bishop instead, because we will get to develop our bishop. And now the idea would be to attack this weakened e5 pawn with something like knight to e7 and knight to g6, or even queen to c7, putting pressure on the e5 pawn. If you do not want to play pawn to c5 and choose to play bishop to f5 instead, which is the most popular main line, you just have to watch out for a few variations. Here, white can play several moves. He can develop with knight to c3, he can play knight to f3, which is the short variation, or he could play a very aggressive pawn to h4. Now, we need to be very careful with this pawn to h4 move, because if we were to play a careless move like pawn to e6, trying to develop our pieces as usual, our bishop is actually trapped now because white plays pawn to g4, kicking back our bishop, and now we see the whole idea of pawn to h4, which is to march the pawn forward, trapping our bishop. Our bishop can only go to e4, only square, and after pawn to f3, our bishop is trapped in just 7 moves. So to counter this move pawn to h4, we can play either pawn to h5, preventing white from pushing up its pawn and also taking away the g4 square, or we could play pawn to h6 as well, because after g4, we simply retreat our bishop this way to h7, and there'll be no problems. Next, let's take a look at the classical variation with knight to c3. Here, we play pawn takes e4, and after knight takes e4, we have 3 options for black, which is bishop to f5, something similar to the advanced variation with bishop f5 as well. We can play knight to f6 or knight to d7. If we play knight to f6 in this position, white usually captures on f6, and we have a choice to recapture back with the g pawn or the e pawn, with both lines having different ideas. However, both lines will result in us having a double pawn like this on the f file. So if you guys do not want to get this double pawn so early in the opening, I would recommend you to play knight to d7 first, preparing the move knight to f6 so that when white captures our knight on f6, we simply recapture back with the knight on d7. However, here you guys have to watch out for a very sneaky checkmate trick, because white can play a very sneaky move like queen to e2, threatening knight to d6 checkmate in 1. So if we were to play a careless move like knight f6, it's just mate in 1 move after knight to d6 checkmate. So instead of playing knight g to f6, we play the other knight, the d knight instead, to f6. So now white doesn't have this knight d6 check because our queen protects the square. Also, by doing so, our queen attacks the d4 pawn as well. And let's say white plays a defending move like pawn to c3. Now we just capture the knight on e4. After queen capture, knight to f6, we develop the knight and gain a tempo by hitting the queen. And in this position, there's no worries for black because we can just develop our pieces normally, like bishop to f5 or bishop to g4, pawn to e6, develop our other bishop, and castle. And there's no problems in this position as black. Again, if you fancy following the most popular opening theory, bishop f5 is the main line in this position. So after bishop f5, our bishop attacks the knight on e4, white retreats it this way, knight to g3, attacking our bishop instead. We also retreat our bishop to g6, and white can play pawn to h4 with a similar idea as in the advanced variation, trying to play pawn to h5, trapping our bishop on the next move. Here we just have to push our h-pawn up 1 square to create that escape route with our bishop on h7, and after h5, bishop h7, let's say move like knight to f3. Again, we just have to develop our pieces normally with like knight to d7, knight to f6, e6, bring our bishop out, castle, and black's position is fine and solid. The fourth main variation, which is the modern variation with knight to d2, is essentially the same thing with knight to c3, the classical variation, because here we just capture the pawn, and after knight captures, this is the same position that we get from the classical variation, where the knight jumped to at c3 and capture back this way instead, where we had 3 options, either to play bishop to f5, knight to f6, or knight to d7. Finally, the fifth main line in the Caro-Kann is pawn to f3, which is the fantasy variation. So here, we capture the pawn on e4, and after white recaptures, we play a really aggressive center pawn move with pawn to e5. The whole idea of this pawn is we free up both our bishop and our queen, as we are threatening moves like queen to h4 check, and we also allow our bishop to develop easily with either bishop to b4 check, or let's say after we trade off the d4 pawns, our bishop can go to c5 as well, taking control of this diagonal. If white captures our pawn on e5, offering a trade of queens, we do not trade queens, and instead we play queen to h4 check, attack hitting the king and hitting this pawn as well. If white tries to block the check with pawn to g3, now we can just capture the pawn on e4, giving another check and winning the rook on h1. So white will probably not capture the pawn on e5 and will play a move like knight to f3, supporting his d4 pawn and also attacking our e5 pawn. And here we just have to play bishop to g4, which is a similar idea in some of the previous variations, developing our bishop to pin the knight to the queen, and now we are putting pressure on the d4 pawn, and again in this variation you would have no problems as black. So now that we covered all the main lines in the Caro-Kann, we have to go through a few moves and other miscellaneous lines that do not go pawn to d4 on the second move. So for example, white can play knight to f3 on the second move. We just play pawn to d5, which is the most normal and basic Caro-Kann move, and if white plays capture, capture, and pawn to d4, this actually transposes to the exchange variation, where white did not play the pan-off variation, but instead played a normal developing move. Similarly, if white plays a move like knight to c3, we play pawn to d5, and if white plays pawn to d4 here, this would transpose to the classical variation. White might try this sneaky move with pawn to c4 on the second move, trying to catch us off guard, because this is called the accelerated pan-off variation. And again, we play pawn to d5, and after captures, if white were to play pawn to d4, this would just transpose back to the normal pan-off variation. But if white captures, now we do not want to capture back with the queen, because white can play knight to c3, gaining a tempo and hitting our queen. So instead, we just have to play knight to f6, and we want to capture back the d pawn with our knight. And if you remember the pawn structure from the Panov variation earlier on in the first line where white plays the exchange, we get a similar type of structure where the pawn on the white's d pawn is an isolated pawn, whereas we have 4 pawns on the king side and 2 pawns on the queen side. So the ideas on how to develop our pieces and how to place them would be very similar to what we did in the Panov variation. And that's it for our video on the Caro-Kann defense. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic idea of the opening to the common main lines for dominating your opponents. By mastering the Caro-Kann defense, you'll be well equipped to take on any opponent and play some solid chess. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more chess content. In the comments below, let us know which variation of the Caro-Kann defense do you play, or which one is your favorite. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.